Good morrow, everyone, and welcome to Shakespeare and Friends, the series in which we engage with some of the big questions surrounding Shakespeare and early modern history. I'm Dan Freebury-Jones, and my co-host is Rachel Arnstead. Now, there was a contemporary of Shakespeare's, the poet John Davis of Hereford, who said that Shakespeare often played kingly parts in sport. So it's conceivable that Shakespeare played some of the monarchical roles in his plays, but was Shakespeare a monarchist? Or, as we might say today, a royalist? What was Shakespeare's attitude towards the monarchy? And I wondered if you could kick off, Rachel, by speaking a little bit about different types of governments and what were the alternatives to being a monarchist or royalist?
Well, exactly. It's all well and good to say, was he something? But if we don't know what the options were, then it doesn't seem like he had much of a choice. But Europe and obviously the world at large had a lot of different governmental systems, and some of those people in London would have known about. Some of them they might not have known so well. Um, but wait, let's take a minute and I'm just going to talk about the backgrounds behind us first. I like to do that right
Oh,
away or I'll forget later. So um,
yes,
you've got Harold behind you being
I have.
crowned, uh, and I've got Elizabeth Woodville behind me. So, a-
Delightful.
and neither of them really got to enjoy
Mm.
their monarchies, did they? So, whatever Shakespeare thought of monarchy, it was rarely a permanent state. It was rarely something that you got to keep for very long, with
Mm.
a few notable exceptions. So, uh, the one that we're most familiar with is hereditary monarchy, agnostic primogeniture, where there's one crown and it goes to the oldest boy. And some places a woman could inherit. Places like France, they had the Salic law that said, you know, none of that was allowed to pass through any women ever. And that was kind of the whole basis of the Hundred-Year War, right? I mean, uh, Henry the Fifth should have had a stronger claim, technically, if it did pass through the female line. Um, but anyway, we won't go off uh, that path. Okay, so then there was another kind of monarchy called elective monarchy, and that's where you basically got voted into that position. And so, like the Holy Roman Emperor, that was an elected office. Even though after a while the Habsburgs were like, you're going to vote for us or we're going to kill you, it was still an elective office, and there were still some pretty big upsets. It was an office that you could sort of buy if you were lucky, but typically it went to a German. It hardly ever went to anybody else because essentially it was, a German role. There's an elective theocratic monarchy, which is it's like the Pope. The Pope is kind of a theocratic monarchy. They have their own region. I mean, the papal states are very small, but it's still the Pope that rules those. Um, let's see here. I'll skip some of these. Um, there was a merchant aristocratic republic. And so there we're talking about Genoa, Venice, uh, where the whole place is pretty much run by merchants. And so instead of status coming from owning land, you got status by being rich. And theoretically got voted in by a group of your peers. It's technically an oligarchy is the other way to think about it. But the fact that it was a republic and that there was kind of I don't know, a flavor of representation. for the people. What that meant is that the people in charge had to make it at least look like they cared about the welfare of the commoner. Whereas, in a monarchy, that wasn't such a big deal. It was wise. It was wise to give that impression a lot of the time. But, if God made you king, then, what the people think doesn't really matter that much. Let's see. A federal republic without a single head of state. The Dutch Republic was not a monarchy, but a confederation of provinces that had abjured their king. Each province retained its own estates and appointed its own stadtholder, who was a military executive and noble figurehead. That sounds very political and complicated. Uh, there were confederations of associated republics and rural communes. The Swiss Confederacy had no single head of state. Each of the 13 cantons was sovereign, with some governed by patrician councils and others by direct popular assembly. And so you've got in a pretty small area all these different patchworks of, of ways that power was distributed. And to a certain extent, much less, the United States is kind of like that. Each state has its own laws and its own way of running its state senate, um, its own procedures, and they're really much more different than I think is obvious on the outside of the United States. And that's why living in one state can be such a huge uh, difference from being living in another one. It can be just a massive cultural shift because everything that you need to approach, like, you know, opening a business or driving a car, all of those things are going to be completely different from one state to the next. And so these can coexist surprisingly well with these big differences in function. I think one of the most interesting is a Tannist monarchy, and that's where the monarchy kind of went between two families. That's what we have with Macbeth. And so, you have two, you start out with one guy at the top, right? And then there's, the family line splits for whatever reason and goes into two directions. And so instead of killing each other, what they do is they say, okay, this branch A gets to be king for a while. And when they die, then branch B gets to be king for a while. And then when B dies, then the next guy on A gets to go. And there's some advantages to this. You're much less likely to have a succession crisis because somebody out of all those people is, likely to have had a baby at some point that could inherit. And, the story of Macbeth and that succession crisis, technically, Macbeth was the next in line. In other words, Malcolm uh, God. Yeah, Malcolm shouldn't have been king next. So Macbeth has a certain justification. Now, obviously we feel like he went about it the wrong way, but in real life, what he did was slaughter his opponent on the battlefield, which is how you
Yeah.
were supposed to settle these things. Let God sort it out, right? If people weren't going by the rules. And, if you won, that meant that you were right, that God had said, yeah, you had the better claim, or or you wouldn't have died, right? If God wanted you to be king. So, there were all different ways of thinking about power and succession and how that happened. Uh, England is unusually strict about a number of things. they did allow women to inherit the crown, so they're less strict than France in a way. But other countries, if if a child was natural born, which is the euphemism for saying, they were illegitimate, if a child was natural born, then, the Pope or whatever could just say, oh, we know that you were married in your heart or whatever, and kind of wave a magic wand, and then that person could inherit. In some countries, that wasn't even necessary. It was just up to the king to say, "Nah, I like that kid better," and that kid's going to be the one that's king, even though you know, I, the mother was a scullery maid. That doesn't matter. It's my choice. I'm the king, and I decide. Uh, one of the most famous, of course, of these is William the Conqueror, also known as William the Bastard, who inherited his father's lands, even though his mother was a tanner, and they obviously, weren't married. Uh, and then he didn't have to inherit anything in England. He just came over and killed everybody, pretty much. I mean, technically, he was related, um, sort of, but you know, but since William the Conqueror, there has not been another natural born monarch on the throne since then. And it's just been incredibly strict what was allowed, unless, of course, you're John of Gaunt and, you have children out of wedlock with Catherine Swynford. Those children were later legitimized, first by the papacy and then by Richard II, and then finally a third time by Henry IV, who put in the provision that they could not take the throne. And so, by the time that trickles down to Henry IV, sorry, Henry VII, um, because he's a descendant of the Beaufort line. His mother's Margaret Beaufort. Um, he's king. And, again, he has to do it sort of by right of conquest and really by right of his wife, probably more than anything else. Then we have Richard III, who, delegitimized his nephews as a way of keeping them off the throne. But nobody really believed that at the time, and very few people believe now that Edward IV was married to the the daughter of John Talbot, the great war hero. But that was a big question about legitimacy, at the time. And then people say, oh, well, that proves that Richard couldn't have killed them because he'd already gotten rid of their legitimacy. But the thing is, if you can sign a document saying children aren't legitimate, then you can sign another document saying that they are, which is, of course, what happened with both Mary the First and Elizabeth the First. Both of them were declared illegitimate, and then, with a little bit of politicking and some pen waving, all of a sudden, Mirabile dictu, they're they're legitimate again. So legitimacy was much more porous than the records would indicate. Something else to consider is that you can never really be sure who the father is. And so this all seems like a way to really try to control women because the penalty for a woman, having extramarital sex was so high if you were a noble, if you were part of the ruling class, because it called into question the whole line, the whole dynastic succession. And so, women were really highly policed and, very badly punished if they had sex outside of the marriage. And it was just less of a deal other places because people weren't quite so hooked up on that idea of legitimacy, on whether or not a child is a real child if if you went through the ritual steps of getting married and everything else. It's a kind of the more I looked into the idea of what is royalness, you know, what makes you eligible to rule, you know, the vaguer it got. And so I think that's partly why we see so much drama kind of around this point because it really is a construct, the idea of legitimacy, the idea of monarchy. We've basically made it all up. And so, that tends to lead things to being very highly regulated. Can you guys hear my dog squealing in the background?
Only yes, yes. That was an affirmative yelp.
All righty. Well,
I
I'm
like it.
gonna
We have a guest for this episode. That's
we
fabulous.
have a guest for
I think
this
that's great.
episode, but what I'm gonna do now is mute my microphone and find another member of the household to rescue my dog who doesn't understand why I'm talking and feels like he has to respond. So, Darren, please tell us about how these kind of nebulous and tricky ideas of monarchy trickled into the public consciousness through drama.
Yes, yes. Well, I love your use of the word drama. Lots of drama around this point, and I think these questions of legitimacy and monarchy, they clearly made for great drama. And the history play, the chronicle history play genre, was hugely popular, and Shakespeare certainly took advantage of that. But I'd like to speak about two ideas or ideologies that Shakespeare appears to have grappled with, and some differing, uh, in fact, antithetically extreme scholarly views on whether Shakespeare goes along with these ideas or even promotes them, or whether he pushes against them and is actually a subversive writer as opposed to a propagandist or a monarchist. So the first idea is that of the divine right of kings, which you've touched on. So according to John Neville Figgis, his book, The Divine Right of Kings, we can bullet points this ideology accordingly. The monarchy is a divinely ordained institution. Hereditary right is indefeasible. The right acquired by birth to rule must not be forfeited through any acts of usurpation. Kings are accountable to God alone, and under any circumstances, resistance to a king is a sin and ensures damnation. And I always find that one point quite interesting. Kings are accountable to God alone, because I like to think a good king is accountable to the wants and needs of his subjects as well. But then you also have this idea of the Tudor myth and questions as to whether Shakespeare is perpetuating the Tudor myth, or, as I said, whether he's being subversive. So, according to the Tudor myth, the period between 1399, the deposition of divinely appointed Richard II, and 1485, the defeat of King Richard III, was characterized by anarchy and bloodshed. And this was God's curse for the deposing and murder of Richard II. That's a bloody long curse, 86 years. But fortunately, God relented and sent peace in the person and dynasty of Henry Tudor. And the Tudor period of the 18th century, more specifically 1485 onwards, was a golden age of peace and prosperity. So this Tudor myth could be perceived as propaganda, essentially. And as I mentioned, scholars have very different views on whether Shakespeare was a subversive writer, whether he was pushing against these ideas, or whether his history plays are providential in design. And you can see that tension throughout his historical plays. So Richard II is quite interesting because Richard is presented, I think, as a divinely appointed monarch. But Shakespeare agrees with his chronicle source materials that Richard has several weaknesses when it comes to governance, that he is the skipping king who will turn a blind eye to the wants and needs of his subjects. And then you've got Henry Bolingbroke, Henry IV, who is this Machiavellian archetype. That's how he's often read in Shakespeare's Richard II and Henry IV plays. And he's a savvy character. He's pragmatic. He's diplomatic. He would make for a pretty good king. But you do get the sense that because he is not divinely appointed, chaos ensues. There's civil unrest. And Shakespeare very cleverly literalizes that sense of civil unrest in Henry's inability to sleep. You have this wonderful moment in Henry IV, Part 2, when Henry is saying that the sea boy, in an hour so rude, in a storm, can sleep, but he cannot. And uneasy lies the head that wears a crown, which is a beautiful line, would make for a wonderful strap line for the Henry IV plays, I think. And I'm not sure how many of our viewers and listeners are Stormzy fans, but the rapper Stormzy made great use of that line, uneasy lies the head that wears a crown. So Henry IV then, of course, dies, and you have Henry V come to the throne. And one of the scholars who believed that Shakespeare was perpetuating the idea of the Tudor myth was named E.M.W. Tilliard. And yet he wrote that Shakespeare presented Hal as the perfect king, which very much goes against this idea that this was a period of anarchy and bloodshed. And Henry V, as a play, has often been presented as uber patriotic. Think of the Laurence Olivier 1944 film. Very much an exercise in patriotism. But I think Shakespeare does something really clever with Henry V. And this is why I love Shakespeare, because he's always flipping an interpretive coin. So what you have in Henry V, which is very rare in Shakespeare, is a Greek chorus. The only other example is the chorus to Romeo and Juliet, two households both alike in dignity. So the chorus enters the stage and says, "Oh, for a muse of fire." And the Greek chorus, that gives you a sense of the epic, and it harks back to classical dramas of antiquity. But the Greek chorus tends to be associated with the tragic genre. And Henry V structurally is a play that resembles a comedy. You've got that lovely wooing scene at the end, haven't you, where Henry woos Catherine of Valois. But there's a curious disparity between what the chorus says and what is then presented on stage. So the chorus will speak of these two mighty armies meeting on the field, and then we'll switch to a scene in which the French Dauphin is talking about writing a sonnet to his horse. The chorus will say that every man plucks courage by Henry's looks. And then we cut to a scene where Henry is in disguise and he hears his subjects saying that they think this is potentially a bad war. And it is victory against the odds. Shakespeare very much emphasizes that. You have something like 10,000 French dead, as opposed to just 29 English, which is going well over what was already a tremendous success historically. But what I find really interesting about Henry V is you can imagine patriotic audience members thinking, yes, victory against the odds, Agincourt. And then the chorus enters the stage right at the end of the drama, and reminds them that everything Henry has gained will be lost during the reign of Henry VI, which feels like a real downer. And it doesn't feel, when you look at that conclusion to the play and the chorus's final lines, it doesn't feel like a pro-war or pro-monarchy play necessarily. So then you have that factious rivalry between the York and Lancaster houses. And according to the Tudor myth, Richard is fundamentally the curse of God. He is rooting out all evil. And this brings the culmination of that curse. And then you have the wonderful Henry VII take to the throne. So there's a sense of providence, there's a sense of historical fatalism, but you also see a tension with Richard between those ideas of fate and providence and Machiavellian power politics and individuality. And I find Richard such a fascinating character because he's meta theatrical. He very much revels in the role he is playing as villain, comparing himself to the formal vice iniquity.
Mhm.
And he speaks to us as audiences frequently. But as the play progresses, he becomes more and more isolated. And he disconnects from us as audiences, far fewer asides and soliloquies. And I think you see a turning point when he actually gains the crown. Now, I don't see Shakespeare as a didactic writer or a moralist, but I
Mhm.
think if there is one message in the history plays, it's that if you come to the throne via nefarious means, you're going to end up clinging tenaciously to it. And I think you see that with Richard. He becomes very impatient, disconnects from the audience, disconnects from the kingdom, disconnects from time. He frequently asks what time it
Mhm.
is. And you really do get a sense of his isolation, of course, at the conclusion of Richard III, when he is alone on the battlefield and he encounters Elizabeth I's grandfather and James I's great grandfather. So this is the great thing about Shakespeare, is that I think you can read him in diametrically opposed ways, that
Mhm.
you can see him as being very pro-monarchy and perpetuating this idea of the Tudor myth and a firm believer in the divine right of kings, or you can see him in the exact opposite way. And I think the history plays are just fascinating.
Well, he's sort of a wiggly little fish, isn't he, Shakespeare? In that, as you think he's going one way and then he zigs and goes another way and then zags, and
Yeah.
you see reflections and flashes of light. You're not ever really sure where he's
Yes.
going or where he came from even. And
Yeah.
for somebody who grew up and worked in such a politically fraught time,
Yes.
I can see the value in writing specifically so that people see what they want to see. And
Yes.
my gosh, what a talent to be
Oh
able
yeah.
to do that. I mean, to me, that feels like kind of the real genius of Shakespeare is that, while all of his friends were getting tortured and worse, um, he managed to rise above it. And even, Richard II, where he gives up his crown, and of course that was controversial at the
Yeah.
time. Even Elizabeth, right, said, can you not see that I am Richard?
I am Richard. Yeah. Yeah.
Because she was always, they're always afraid of losing their crown. Um,
Mm.
and yet, it's really hard to see Henry as a hero, honestly.
Mm.
Like, is it a long cautionary tale
Mm.
about deposing a monarch? Is it part of that Tudor myth, as you were mentioning,
Yeah.
where it's like this is just the first step in a long uh, kind of line of destabilizing
Mm.
rulers, and where any gains you make are bound to be temporary because
We're so
you built on shifting sand to start with.
Yeah, it's so interesting that Essex and his faction clearly thought, put Richard II on at the Globe, this rather mouldy tale at this point, and this is going to garner support. This is going to incite people, and it doesn't read like a pro-usurpation play to me.
I don't think Essex was the smartest tool in the shed, is all I will say. I don't think I don't think he was worthy of Elizabeth's admiration to start with. I mean, clearly, just to undertake such a thing was daft to begin with, right? So
To
it's hardly,
burst into chambers and yes, yeah, yeah. It's a comedy of
uh,
errors, really.
yeah, yeah. I guess he could have picked something worse, but it would be hard to think of what exactly.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
uh, Something that I kind of want to address the whole Tudor myth idea and Tilliard. And I adore Tilliard. How can
mm,
you not if you're, a fan of the period? Tilliard brings so much to light that would
mm,
otherwise be kind of very obscure. Uh,
mm.
but I think he takes this Tudor myth idea too far. I think
Yeah,
he makes too much of it, uh,
yeah,
to the point where people now say, oh, everything Shakespeare wrote was Tudor propaganda. And
yes, yeah, yeah. And that persists, doesn't it? You
it
hear that
persists
still very
today.
frequently.
I,
Yeah,
I,
yeah,
I get in arguments online about it all the time. So,
yeah.
and I've probably mentioned this, and I'm sure I have because it's one of my, rants. But
Bugbears.
yeah, my bugbears, exactly. Uh, that the plays are not all complimentary to the Tudors.
No.
They're not all complimentary to the Stuarts. Hamlet and Shakespeare's depiction of Denmark,
Mm,
although written before James and Anna took the throne, it's iffy whether that's a good play for Anna to
mm,
have that out there on this idea that the Danes are insane, basically,
mm,
that they come
mm,
from this place and this climate and they've got ghosts wandering around, and
mm,
or the damned are wandering around, or demons, whatever they are. It doesn't make monarchy or uh, Danish culture look like something that should be on the throne. Um,
mm. And
and then,
it's an elective monarchy in Hamlet as well, isn't it? Which is
mhm,
interesting when Hamlet says that Claudius popped between the election and my
mhm.
hope, that Hamlet has that aspiration to become king himself. Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's not quite a Tanist. That's kind of a different thing where there was an election, but it was always, the heir to the throne that got voted in. But it
Yeah.
was sort of a confirmation kind of a thing of like, yeah, okay, we commit to following you is kind of what an election like that was.
Mm.
And the uncle took advantage of Hamlet being in college to
Yes,
pop in
yes.
there, do a little arm twisting, pay a few people off,
Yes,
and
yes.
get elected. But
Despite the love, the general gender, bear Hamlet. Yes, yeah.
exactly. And then we kind of also have to look at that they didn't need a Tudor myth
Mm,
by the time Elizabeth was queen. Uh, there were no Plantagenets,
mm,
knocking at the gates. There
mm,
was,
mm,
all those people were dead by the
mm,
time Elizabeth took the throne. In fact, the only people that were a threat to her were Tudors, right? Mary, Queen
mm,
of Scots, is a Tudor. She is the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister.
mm,
And so, James Stuart gets his right to the throne through the Tudor line at that
mm.
point.
Yeah.
And, I'm just wondering, why would they have bothered? You know, if they really wanted to amp up this idea of the Tudors are great, the Tudors are good, why didn't he make a play about Henry VII?
Mm,
It would have been really easy to make a very heroic play about Henry VII, in spite of the truth. You know, I mean, he did manage to stabilize the realm. And let's face it, there were 80 something years of plague, economic disaster, military losses, uh, horrible bloodshed wherein all the male members of all the ruling houses slaughtered each other to the point where
mm,
the entire aristocracy was pretty much hollowed out.
mm,
And, where, paradoxically, like what was left was the women. There was nobody left but Elizabeth of York to bring that royal line through back from Edward III. And then, of course, you had all these heiresses stinking rich because their father had been killed, their brothers had been killed, their uncles had been killed. They're basically, the last one standing that can inherit everything. And so then, who got to marry those also created this sort of destabilizing situation. Uh, as we saw, Richard III's brothers are annoyed because they wanted to marry an heiress that,
mm,
that Edward IV gave to his brother-in-law, gave to one of the rivers. So it was bad.
mm,
It it really was bad. And, were I a, devout Catholic who believed in an anointed king, as people had believed for centuries,
mm,
then yeah, I might seriously think that, from Bolingbroke on, we just have kind of one mess after another, after another, after another. And then Henry V becomes a lesson in hubris,
mm,
in that, sure, you can have all these big victories. Sure, you can, strut around like you own the place and everybody can call you a hero, but you don't belong on that throne.
mm,
And, you know, you're going to die of dysentery,
mm,
and, your infant son is going to be mad and
mm,
going to be in a position where he's simply incapable of holding together this idea of, a reign that included France, but that was wrong, was essentially poisoned to start with. Um, so I think you can see it either way. I think,
yes.
as we
Yeah,
were
yeah, yeah.
saying with Shakespeare,
Oh, yeah.
it can definitely go either way. Um,
So interesting that the Tilliard that he says that Shakespeare was compelled to portray Hal in his traditional role of perfect king,
mhm,
because that rather goes against Tilliard's views, I think. But then you've got scholars like Stephen Greenblatt who see
mm.
Hal slash Henry is a conniving hypocrite. And this is just the fascinating thing about Shakespeare's characterization is that his characters can be perceived in such diametrically opposed ways. Is he a hero warrior? Or is he a conniving hypocrite? Probably a little bit of both at times, I think.
And it gives, as you've brought up before, he's an actor's playwright, and he
Yes.
is an actor. And essentially, that gives the actor the choice of what kind of Henry they're going to
Yes.
represent, what kind of Henry they believe in. And that
Yeah.
must have been incredibly useful, depending on which kind of neighborhood you were in. Like,
Mm,
imagine you're performing this in France,
mm.
right? You might present these kings very differently than than you would, in London or in Scotland or anywhere. You could adjust the moral weight or the moral, what's the word? Um, validity, the moral validity of your king, depending on who you were performing for. And so perhaps, Shakespeare was just a capitalist, really. Perhaps, he was just looking for the way that you could fill seats and to make this
Yes.
kind of
Yeah.
um, vague pronounce it. I think he was anti-tyrant.
Yes. Yes.
I think
I
we
don't
can
get the,
say
yeah, I
that.
don't get the sense he's pro-tyrant.
Not pro-tyrant. Look at what happened to Caesar.
Yes.
Look at what happens to Macbeth. Um,
Yeah.
and it could be that he didn't see the world in the narrow terms that we would like to be able to define him with.
Yeah.
Um, you know.
I mean, Julius Caesar is a fascinating play because Shakespeare doesn't explicate tyranny, does he? There have been scholars who have said Julius Caesar is a play with no villains. Is a really interesting drama, Julius
Hmm.
Caesar.
Wow. I, gosh, I see villains in Caesar. I
Mm,
mean,
yeah.
to me, they're kind of all villains, aren't they? I mean, it's just, you
Oh
know,
well, well, that's we flipped the coin. Is a play with no heroes. Yeah, but
yeah.
that's great though. That's great though, isn't it? You talk about different perspectives. It's
Well, are the
but
tribunes
if you compare
heroes?
Julius
You
Caesar,
know?
if you compare Julius Caesar to Johnson's Roman plays, for example, is
Mm.
quite different. Where
So what is the
the tyrants are
difference?
clearly tyrannical
I
in
see.
Johnson, whereas Shakespeare is always voicing different sides
Hmm.
of the arguments. Johnson's quite straightforward, I think, in his dramatization of tyranny in a Roman context. Yeah.
Yeah, and then we kind of have to ask, at that point, well, what were the English thinking about Rome at the time? And how would
Mm,
they have seen Julius Caesar? They
mm,
were very big on Augustus.
mm,
And Augustus did not like Mark Antony. So, it's real clear that Mark Antony is not a desirable character
mm,
to Shakespeare and to the English at the time, and
mm,
possibly a stand-in for Essex. I think we considered in the past, but
mm.
Caesar. Um, I don't know. Again, he's not an anointed king, is he? He just kind of
Mhm,
rolled across the river there and then said, here I am.
mm,
Here I am. I'm in charge now. So,
mm.
gosh, I don't know. Like, in a way, this was kind of a an unanswerable question for us, I
Yes.
think.
Yeah. But was Shakespeare a monarchist? Was Shakespeare a royalist? On the surface, it seems historically quite easy to answer that. You would say, yes, of course he was.
Hmm.
His plays, we know plays such as Love's Labour's Lost, The Merry
Hmm.
Wives of Windsor were performed before Elizabeth, and then, of course, multiple plays performed before King James, because Shakespeare was a king's man. So
Hmm.
surely he must have been a royalist. He's got the king himself as his company patron. I do find it interesting that Shakespeare wasn't involved in accession pageants, never wrote a courtly masque, and that's just quite interesting when you compare him to other
That's a really good
Jacobean
point.
dramatists in particular, and you wonder, is it just because he has a love for public theatre, although his plays are performed at
Hmm.
court, as we've just established? Why doesn't he turn
Why
his
doesn't he
hand at
kiss
all to
ass?
those genres. Yes, yes. What isn't he? And there are moments in the plays that you think that's a little bit kiss assy, but
Hmm.
I think he could have been a lot firmer with kissing ass than he was. And Shakespeare is not an unquestioning playwright, and for me, he is certainly not a propagandist, and he does represent the strengths and also the flaws of various monarchs throughout history. And this is the great thing, particularly in the Henry VI plays, for example, where you are getting those contrary perspectives when it comes to the York and Lancaster houses voiced by different sides of the fence. So it doesn't feel didactic to me. So, like I said, it feels on the surface like an easy question to answer, but the great thing about Shakespeare is it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly what he thought, exactly what
Hmm.
his opinions or ideologies were. And rather than being frustrated by that, I think, we should rejoice in that, because that is precisely why Shakespeare endures and why creatives can put on some of his history plays, as I mentioned that Henry V from 1944 earlier,
Hmm.
as a pep talk in patriotism, or they can put them on stage, or the Kenneth Branagh film, for example, and they can appear quite subversive. They can appear quite politically fraught. This is the great thing about Shakespeare for me.
I think too, though, when people look at this question, I think they fixate on the Wars of the Roses history plays,
Yeah, yeah.
starting from Richard II, because we've got King John,
We have
who,
got King John, yes.
you know, is an anointed Plantagenet king.
Yes,
You know, he deserved that crown theoretically. And then, in that same play, Eleanor shows up,
yes,
Eleanor of Aquitaine, and, she'd been queen and, was as legitimate a queen as it's possible to be. And none of those characters end up looking great. Certainly
yeah,
John, we know that John, uh, universally hated, still shows
yeah,
up on every list of most hated monarch at the very
yeah, yeah,
top, just
yeah,
really predictably. So, I think that it's fair to say that nobody likes living under a tyrant, and
yes,
that was probably more of a concern
mm,
to Shakespeare and his audiences than exactly which family they belong to, which dynasty, how they got there. They
yeah,
just don't want to be ground into the dust, under the boot
yeah,
of who's ever sitting on the throne. So,
yeah,
you know, I kind of wonder. We were talking a little bit before we started recording about the idea of what a royalist is. And you were saying that didn't really come into being until later, right? Until
English Civil War,
the English
yeah,
Civil War. And
yeah,
so I wonder if that was even something in their minds
mm,
in the
yeah,
16th century, whether or not
yeah,
you could be a royalist. I feel
yeah,
like people were so tied to their land and where they came from. And there's this sort of circular logic of, well, we have monarchies here because we're English, and we're English because we have monarchies. And so
mm,
it kind of never, it never kind of leapt out of that to the point of saying, oh, well, I wonder if we want to have a republic like the Venetians do. Well, the English had a complicated perspective of the Italians, but I would not say that a sort of blind admiration of their political system was at the top of their list of how they felt about Italians. I think they looked at Italians as being, chaotic,
mm,
unpredictable, unstable, dangerous, hubristic, all of these things. And,
mm,
we have to remember too that Italy was not a unified country then, the way
mm,
England was. You
mm,
know, Italy was still, a bunch of competing city-states, Milan and Genoa and Venice all having wars with each other. And, it was very chaotic. Whereas England, I think in part thanks to geography, thanks to the Normans, thanks to the Romans, a whole succession of events and circumstances, got unified fairly early on. And certainly, at the end of Elizabeth's reign and at the beginning of James's reign, it was unified, right? Scotland, Ireland, Wales, England were one thing briefly,
mm,
but they
mm,
were. And
mm,
I think that really affected their perception of what was a reasonable kind of government to have.
mm,
Obviously it was a benefit to have a strong, unified country and not to
mm,
be like those wacky Germans and those, confused Italians. Look at us. We've got our whole land here. We control this whole thing. We're unified.
mm,
We're all speaking this one language. We're, adhering to this one religion, even if we've got problems with that, but we've
mm,
decided, this is what it is and we're all going with it. So, yeah, maybe it's not a question they would have asked in the same way that Catholics a few centuries before, none of them would have asked, um, you know, is the Pope, whatever Pope it is that a
mm,
legitimate expression of, God's will? Now they can argue
mm.
about who the Pope was supposed to be, but they
Yeah,
pretty much
yeah,
all agreed on what the Pope was supposed to do. Um,
yes, yeah,
and, it wasn't until, well, later that got to be a question. And
mm,
I do, I wonder, is the fact that religion got questioned so thoroughly, then that by nature had to trickle down in terms of to what was an anointed king? What did
yes,
that
yeah,
mean? And, if Catholicism was no longer respected,
mm,
then were the previous kings valid? How do you even parse all that out?
mm,
You know, during a reformation, how do you suddenly decide, oh, well, you know, they were all anointed by a heretic
mm,
faith,
mm.
So, uh, yeah, probably just butts and seats. That's probably just the easiest way to think about it. Um, you know,
Yeah.
and then if I like playing kings, making sure that I like my lines.
Yes, yeah. It is interesting that notion of Shakespeare playing kings because oftentimes the king isn't the largest role in the
No,
history play.
no.
It's a pretty useful role to play if you're a hands-on author, I think. Yeah. But I think Shakespeare's fascinated by power, isn't he? And uh, as
Hmm.
we were saying, he's got an antithetical thought process, so he's also fascinated by the abuse of power, and we see that throughout the canon, but in the chronicle history plays genre in particular. Yeah.
Definitely. And when I think about his portrayal of queens,
Mm,
hard pressed to think of one that came out looking good.
yes. Yeah. I
I,
mean,
I,
I love Queen Margaret, but I'm not going to
I
say
do
she
too.
came out looking good. I love her, but yeah.
Yeah, he does not make her look good. And even Titania as a queen of the fairies,
Yeah.
you know. uh, not not very not very royal, not very she's having
Mm.
sex with asses. So
Well, yeah,
uh,
yeah,
and then when she realized that's happened, goes, oh,
yeah,
let's go dancing. Like it's a, she's not
yes,
going through, oh, I can't believe, I blah 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 blah, blah. Nothing like that. It's like, oh, what a night. Um,
yeah.
so the do we go down, he's very rarely kind of, we very rarely interrogate him in terms of his attitude towards female royalty, although we
Mm,
should,
mm,
because it was a big deal at the time,
mm,
between Mary and Elizabeth, and all the issues that brought up about femininity and rulership and everything else. So, for all of that, he does not do anything to make Elizabeth look good.
mm,
I think if he, with the exception of in Henry VIII, he makes Elizabeth's mother into a Protestant hero.
mm. I mean, that's a weird play mind, isn't it? Henry VIII is
Yes.
it's very curious because, of course, when Henry VIII is written, Queen Elizabeth is has been long dead, but
Hmm.
it just seems so conscious of potentially offending somebody that it's just a very curious play, Henry VIII. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think, if we look at it as a condemnation of Catholicism,
Mm,
and that was the purpose of it. It wasn't really to make a political statement. It was meant to make a religious one. It was meant
mm,
to say, look, Henry VIII, decided that this was the direction to go in,
mm,
and so that's why, Catherine of Aragon, why it was okay to put her aside and bring, Anne Boleyn on. We will just kind of, ignore what happens to Anne
mm,
and just and point out that she becomes almost this kind of martyr for
mm,
Protestantism. Keeping in mind that Henry was not a Protestant, he was still a Catholic. He just wanted to be his
mm.
own pope. So,
Yeah.
really, we're looking at Anne as being the reason that Protestantism exists in England the way
Mm,
that it does, and
mm,
why, Elizabeth and then James, had Protestant reigns. So,
mm.
yeah, I just I just don't think he was thinking about the, you know, that whole question. So
Yes, but we are, and that's the important thing, Rachel.
I think we are, but and one of the reasons that, and it's a good question to think about,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
it helps us think about, our own relationship to power. Our,
yeah.
uh, does somebody have to be a king to be a tyrant? Clearly, no.
Mm, mm,
You know, does how does the balance of power get shifted depending on how that person presents? Doesn't matter really in the long run what any individual king or queen thinks or is, how they're viewed, because they're all dust, right?
mm,
I mean, that's really the lesson of the history plays, is they all died. And that's, you know, all of their pretension, all of their goals, they pretty much ended up right back where they started.
wow, yeah. Let us sit down and tell sad tales of the deaths of kings. Yes.
Exactly, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah,
So should we move on to
I think
writers'
so.
corner?
I think we've
Yes.
flogged this one too.
So what are you up to at the moment? I gather you're working on proofs and you're also
Yeah, working
writing.
on. working on proofs and indexes for Shakespeare's influences or the influences behind Shakespeare's plays and who's who in Shakespeare's history plays from
Mm,
Achilles to Anne Boleyn is coming along. I'm about close to doing the index on that. And this is the first time that I've written books for a publisher. And, it's a very different process. It's a much longer process.
yeah.
And I'm starting to appreciate that, that it does take longer, that you do have more time, that you're forced to take more time to really
Mm,
go through and dot those I's and cross those T's. Uh,
mm,
in the last, gosh, it's been, yes, April, about 4 months since I submitted Who's Who. I've learned things,
mm.
that made me go back and change things that I had written. And,
Yeah.
you know, we're fallible human beings, historians are. And, there was at one point I had read something that led me to believe that George of Clarence, that George Plantagenet, had been fostered out to Warwick, the Kingmaker, as a child. Now, Richard III was, but George was not. And so somehow I got that idea in my head. Did I misread something? Did somebody else in one of the zillions of books I read just kind of wonder if that had happened and I picked that up and put it in the book? I don't know. But I went through and I deleted all those references because I was able to find that no, actually, uh, George was the heir apparent. And
Mm.
so he was in court with his mother and his older brother. He was not staying with Warwick during that time
Mm.
the way Richard was.
It's funny how you internalize things, isn't it? It's lecturing on Othello, speaking about Michael Cassio. I would often give
Mm.
because I talk about how fanciful Michael Cassio is, and I would often give the speech that women will walk barefoot to Palestine for a touch of his nether lip. And then a colleague recently pointed out that that speech is not about Michael Cassio at all. It's about Lodovic. Uh, but I had internalized that
Yeah,
speech was about Cassio. So it's, as you say, we're all fallible. And I think it's a great speech anyway.
it
It serves the
is.
same purpose.
It is.
Um,
Whoever it's for, it doesn't matter
yeah,
so much.
but but
But
but, but you rifle through the play and you think,
oh
well,
God.
maybe it is about Cassio in the war in the 1622 quarter or something. It's like, no, it's just you've just been lying to
Oh,
yourself for years.
yeah, and the horrible thing is doing it publicly, repeatedly. Um,
Oh wow, yeah.
I mean, uh, like I don't. I think I've mentioned this before, but for a long time I was duped by the fallacy that people didn't rehearse in Shakespeare's day. Um,
Ah, yeah.
and I became convinced of that because where I live, there is a thriving theater company that its whole premise is that they don't rehearse ahead of time. They only work from cue scripts. They even have the idea that like nobody knew until that day what role they were going to perform, which is
Mm,
obviously false.
mm,
People perform the same roles over and over and over again.
mm,
Richard Burbage didn't wonder if it was going to be him playing Hamlet. Of course, he was
mm,
going to be the one playing Hamlet. But
mm,
big thriving company here. And
mm.
as a result, the entire Shakespeare theater community here believed that. Now,
Wow.
I had never heard that theory when I moved here. And then everybody was like, oh, yeah, yeah, this is blah, 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 blah. So I'm like, oh, wow, this is fascinating. And so I wasn't writing books then. I wasn't kind of in that frame of mind by any means. And so I didn't interrogate it very far. Um, And when I had my own Shakespeare company, I didn't want to do it that way, and so I didn't. I had a much more traditional Shakespeare company in that sense. We rehearsed, we memorized our lines, all of that. And then I did a podcast
Mm.
with some other directors, and I hadn't met you yet, and so you know, I, I
Yeah.
I did this podcast with other directors where we talked about different plays and, you know, how we had approached different scenes and solved different problems. And one of those directors was for one of these original practice Shakespeare companies, but she was back east. And
Okay.
she too completely believed this. Like
No rehearsals.
no rehearsals except for fights and dances.
Wow. I mean, estimates vary with some scholars think a few days of rehearsal, some scholars think several weeks. But I remember a few years back, I was invited to at the last minute to do a script in hand performance of a John Fletcher play for the Malone Society. And so I turned up having had no rehearsal whatsoever, but I didn't have to memorize cue scripts. I had the script in my hand, and I was completely unfamiliar with any blocking. And it was a comedy, this Fletcher play, but
Hmm.
my God, I died on stage. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I was burned by that. You have to have a rehearsal for the blocking at the very least. I had no
Yeah.
idea who I was addressing my lines to.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And what they would do is they would have one-on-one rehearsals with the director,
Mm,
and the director would sort of give them the idea for blocking. And this is unfortunate, but what that meant is that the director was in a position to be inappropriate with
all
a
right.
lot of his actors. And
Mm,
so, it kind of served this other really twisted purpose for
mm,
that particular director, in that it allowed him to isolate uh, the people that he was interested in getting with. I will say, and this was before I knew any of that, you know, mud. I saw quite a few of their productions, and they were fun for me because
yeah.
I know the plays, but
Yes.
the audience was lost all the time,
Yeah.
all the
Really.
time. Like, you cannot guide people if you don't know where you're going. And an actor must guide the audience through the
Mm,
story. That's your whole job, is to,
mm,
you know, bring us with you. And if the actor is
yeah.
going, wow, I've never done this role before, I'm not clear on who's playing what, or
Mm,
what we're addressing. Um,
mm,
there were some moments of genuine brilliance, on the
mm.
part of the actors, because when you're pressed against that kind of a circumstance,
Oh yeah.
sometimes the adrenaline kicks in, and you're amazing. And,
Mm,
that happened quite a bit. But there was also quite a bit that got lost because you could tell the actors didn't really understand what they were saying,
yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and they hadn't had that time to develop the meaning with their
Mm,
fellow actors in
mm,
rehearsal. There's something
mm,
so beautiful that
mm.
comes out of watching performers create these
Yeah.
relationships. And those don't happen instantaneously, those happen over time and,
Yeah.
repetition, and thinking about it and doing a scene and then going home and thinking, I'm missing something that, I know this could be more. And then
Mm,
waking up the next day and going, oh, okay, I know what I
mm,
need to do here. I know that I need to look at that actor differently, or look away at that moment when I say that
mm,
word. Um,
mm.
And
It's communal, isn't it? It's
it really
fundamentally
is.
communal.
It
And,
really is.
and it was the rehearsal process doing Shakespeare that I would probably enjoy the most, and
Me
developing
too.
those relationships, and
Yeah, yeah,
so much paratext, so much going on beyond memorizing your lines or even unlocking meaning. Is you create memories for life really with some of your fellow cast members, don't you? Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. And yes, back in the 16th century, they had a different rehearsal process. We know that.
Mm,
Um, but it's also true that they sort of had a kind of set of traditional movements and ways of expressing themselves, depending on, what kind of character they were playing and what the tone of the play was and what their emotion was. They'd have certain gestures that
mm,
they could rely on. And so, in that sense, they needed less rehearsal. It's like
mm,
they knew, if heavy is the head that wears the crown, they
mm.
knew that they were expected to do whatever it was that they did
Yeah,
at
yeah.
a line like that. And so I'm sure their rehearsals looked very different from
Mm,
ours for a number of reasons. We're looking for kind of a more authentic, a more personal interpretation than
mm,
they perhaps were a lot of the time. Uh,
mm,
but it's also true that they would do the same parts over and over. And so, you've got the same group of actors
mm.
and how you did Hamlet last year. Well, you're going to do it exactly the same way this year. Why change
And I, and I
anything?
think with that as well, because that's something I've been considering lately with the Shakespeare and Panto book, is that you also have, like you say, the specific roles that an actor
Hmm.
might take multiple times, but also the types of roles. Like you said, Richard Burbage would
Hmm.
know I'm the one playing Hamlet.
Sure.
I wanted to say Darling then, but there's no way he sounded anything like that. Um, but
We
you
don't
do.
know. We don't know.
I don't think he was right. William. I know I'm playing Hamlet, darling. Um, but you have your
I
Will
think it would be
Kemp's and
more,
other
can you
kind of
do that?
roles.
Can you do that with sort of a little more boom to it? Can you kind of zhuzh it up a little bit?
I would be playing Hamlet, darling.
There we
Yes,
go.
yeah.
See, now that I can
Yeah.
I can totally see him saying. In any
But you
event,
have actors playing, particular types
yes.
of roles. Will Kemp with,
Yes.
with the clowns,
Yes,
Robert Armian.
exactly.
You might have John
Exactly.
Hemmings playing old man roles.
Hmm.
But Shakespeare, of course, you've got those archetypes or stock types, if
Hmm.
you like. Shakespeare also, pushes against some of the stereotypes of those roles as well.
He does. And you know, when you're in an ensemble, um, and especially in the kind of almost incestuous atmosphere of the London theater scene in that 10 years, uh,
Mm.
you start to be able to anticipate what your fellow performers are going to do,
Oh
in this
yeah.
in the same way that you know what your spouse is going to say next when
Mm.
you're at a dinner party. Okay, this story's coming up you know So I think that when you have that kind of consistency and comfort and predictability with your fellow performers,
Yeah.
then you can sort of go into these situations with less rehearsal. You don't
Yes.
have to spend months doing it like we do. You're like, okay,
Yeah.
well, uh, Will's going to be the king again. We
Mm.
know he's going to stomp around the stage and do a flourish and sit in his chair or whatever he did. Um, and
Mm.
so that might have made things easier too. But
Mm.
um, all this aside, I believed
Mm.
this uh, sheer fabrication based on one book by I think I want to say Stephen Parker or something. I'm probably wrong about that. I'll put the name in
Mm.
the notes, and a mention to the book. But to the point where when I did this podcast, Like we talk about this as a serious thing, as a
Mm.
reality. And
Mm.
it's terrible. It's terrible because, here I'm trying to sound knowledgeable, right? And yet
Mm.
here I am promoting this completely crock, crackpot theory. I was going to say crock pot, which is not quite the same thing,
I
but
thought you were going to say something totally else then that began with crock.
oh,
Yeah, yeah.
there is a whole other kind of crock, isn't there? Anyway, so like I'm even hesitant to promote those podcasts. So I did
Aye.
go and record before the beginning of each of those episodes a disclaimer where, I said that, look, this theory has been disproved. Um,
Mm.
it's not true. And I know we speak about it as if it's a thing, but,
Mm.
please just consider it as another way of performing this that
Mm.
some people do today, but it is not the traditional way things were. And, one of the things that kind of gets me now is that, the director who was doing that kind of theater was a little snooty about it.
Mm.
Was a little bit like, oh, well, we're doing it the original way. This is the
Mm.
way Shakespeare would have done it. This is, the way everybody should be doing it. And, my position has always been you make the Shakespeare that you want to make and that works for your community, that's the
Yes.
ideal, that you're performing it for your community. Um,
Yeah.
and so she just kind of has this attitude, which, my theater community here in Portland did as well, had this kind of attitude that like, oh, we're doing it the right way. And it's
Mm.
it's not the right way. So if you're one of those people, I'm sorry, burst your bubble. Um, it's not true. It's not true. Luckily, I found that out before I wrote any of my books. So
Yes, 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 yes. Well,
hallelujah.
yeah, yeah. No, that's what revisions are for, isn't it? Or
It
revised
is.
editions. Yeah,
It is.
yeah.
All right. So let's see. We'll wrap this up pretty quick here. Working on my silver book, and I'm up to the 14th century. So
Mm.
there's lots of plague and famine and uh, economic distress and everything else in my future, and just looking to dig into it.
The economic stress in my future. Yes, I can identify with that.
But tell me, Darren, what are you up to?
Uh, Up to at the moment, I'm still chipping away at the Shakespeare and Panto book.
Hmm.
But got an exciting delivery recently, so it's finally published. I was holding it up the screen. It's
Yay!
never. Oh no! Oh, you can. Oh, yeah, you can
Almost. There
see
you
it.
go. Perfect.
So volume two of the collected works of Thomas Kidd. So that is volume two of two. So this has been a
Wow.
project that has been going on, officially since 2018. But the canon of Thomas Kidd was the subject of my PhD. So
Hmm.
yeah, it just feels like the culmination of many years of
Wow.
formative work in
How
Thomas
many
Kidd.
years?
Oh goodness.
When did you start on your kid fixation?
It's probably been around 13 years now.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and it's been around uh, 7, 8 years with the edition itself, working with Brian Vickers and the editorial team. So
Hmm.
it's just been fabulous, and I'm particularly proud of volume two. I think so. Delighted to be able to hold that,
Oh,
uh, and yes,
congratulations.
yes,
That's
yes.
wonderful.
So very
So,
happy.
what drew you to kid?
Oh, good question. I think with my MA, I wrote my dissertation on the Shakespeare Apocrypha. So I
Hmm.
was looking at plays that have been attributed to Shakespeare, ranging from Arden of Faversham to The Birth of Merlin. And so I read extensively, very sort of a Victorian approach, which I think is still paramount. So taking the time to actually read all of these plays and read the
Mhm.
plays of candidate dramatists. And I felt reading the Spanish tragedy, for example, and then reading some of the plays that we now attribute to Kidd in the edition, I thought, oh, this sounds very similar. I feel I can hear the
Mhm.
same voice, with no idea that those anonymous plays had been attributed to Thomas Kidd, and that
Mm.
actually the work of Brian Vickers, who's general editor, was running parallel to me in my salad days, looking at anonymous dramas for the first time. So, and I just think he's a fascinating dramatist, Thomas Kidd. He's not considered as sexy as Christopher Marlowe, but I think
As what?
he's as sexy
Oh,
as
it's
Christopher Marlowe.
sexy.
Yeah, sexy. But I think he has a
Yeah,
wonderful way of individualizing his characters
I see.
and going up and down the linguistic gears in terms of your prose speeches for, say, the page boy in the Spanish tragedy we were
Mhm.
speaking about before, or uh, the lamentations of a character like Geronimo. And I'm baffled by the stereotype that he was this bombastic, uber violent writer.
He's
I,
certainly
that's just
very handsome. I mean, if we're going for sexy, I don't
so with Thomas Kidd, that image that gets passed around as Kidd, we have no extant, so far
Oh,
as we're aware, image of Thomas Kidd. I believe that the image that is always presented as Kidd's, that portrait, is
and
Ferdinando
sometimes
Stanley.
Shakespeare is
Yeah, so it's Ferdinando Stanley, Lord Strange. So it is not Thomas
oh,
Kidd. Thomas Kidd appears to have worked for Lord Strange, but it always gets passed around. Whenever you see any kind of article on Thomas
I
Kidd, that is
believed
the
it.
image. Yeah,
I
well,
totally
yeah, yeah,
believed it.
yeah, yeah.
Another another illusion shattered. Um,
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I mean, he might have been
it's
very
fine.
handsome.
Honestly, it does. That portrait does not look like the face of a man who wrote the Spanish tragedy. I'm sorry. It just there isn't a lot of depth behind the eyes in that portrait. He's a very handsome fellow, but doesn't strike me as being particularly deep. Um,
Yeah, but
no,
it's curious that, isn't it? Devoted so many years to this writer, and I have no idea what he looks like.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
no idea. Yeah, yeah.
Well, we'll just decide he looks like you. How's that? We'll start putting your picture.
Oh, the poor
We'll
sport.
Photoshop you and a whole thing.
Put me in a rough.
We'll
Put
start
me
it
in a.
a whole. It'll start a whole rumor. We'll say we found this painting.
I'll do my Richard Burbage. Yes, yes. I'll be playing Thomas Kidd, darling.
Oh boy. Um.
Okay, let's move on. um,
Okay. So let's see. Oh, but you also did recently. You had a conversation with um.
Susan Dwight Amuson. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that was a nice conversation for Fame. So an online event, and we were discussing Susan's book, What's in a Name? How Historians Know Shakespeare with Shakespeare, as well as my book, Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers. So it was it was an interesting conversation. Susan's looking at things from a historian's perspective and spending a lot of time in digital archives
Mhm.
and uh, comparing that to my research, which is a bit more of a literary perspective,
Right.
I think,
Right.
but also looking at digital archives in a sense,
Mhm.
analyzing plays using electronic corpora, for example. So Susan was lovely, and it was a really really fun conversation actually.
Awesome.
Yeah,
And is
really
that
nice.
something that people can still find online?
Oh, they could find her online. Whether they can still book or not, I'm not sure. So you could book uh, online, and you would then have access to
Mm-hmm.
the video for 2 weeks afterwards. So it might be, if you are interested, anyone watching or listening, have a Google of
Or
my name and
we'll put a
Susan
link.
Twilight.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's see. See if when you get the link, if it does still have the option to book, then maybe we'll share. If it doesn't, then yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry.
You missed out. It was good.
It was no doubt, no doubt. So, let's see. Books. Are we ready for books?
Yes, yeah. Shall I go first?
Yep, because I don't have any.
You don't have any. Oh my
I don't
goodness.
have any. I know. I know. I'm sorry. I was
Okay.
completely leaning on you this time to
Oh, that's
come up with
okay.
book recommendations.
So I would recommend Michael Bogdanov's book, Shakespeare: The Director's Cut: Essays on the Tragedies, Comedies, and Histories. And I think Michael Bogdanov is just a fascinating theatre director and offers such fresh perspectives on any play he writes about. But in terms of this discussion, worth
Mhm.
checking out the essays on the histories in particular. And I've written on Michael Bogdanov in an essay titled Michael Bogdanov's oh, excuse me, I glitched a little bit then. Michael Bogdanov's iconoclastic approach to political Shakespeare. So this was an essay I had published in. It was a bit of a mouthful when I
That is
reflected.
really a mouthful.
That was that was an essay in the journal New Theatre Quarterly. It was published in 2019,
Mhm.
and what I do in it is use Bogdanov. He was a Welsh director. His English Shakespeare Company productions as case studies, and what Michael Bogdanov presents are highly politicized versions of Shakespeare's history plays.
Mm.
And I take a look in that essay at how the influences of theoretical movements like cultural materialism inflected performances of Michael Bogdanov's plays. I mentioned as well John Neville, Figgis, classic study, The Divine Right of Kings. I mean, if you're interested in The Divine Right of Kings, then I guess I could also recommend Basilic and Doran by King James, published
Mhm.
1599, I believe. Stephen Greenblatt, very famous essay, Invisible Bullets, Renaissance Authority and its Subversion, Henry IV and Henry V. And this was published in a collection that had a huge influence on Michael Bogdanov's history play productions, Political Shakespeare, Essays in Cultural Materialism, which was edited by Jonathan Dollimore and Alan Sinfield and published by Manchester University Press in 1985, I believe. And Greenblatt explores Shakespeare's history plays in relation to state censorship
Mm.
of theatre, and he argues that Shakespeare's works can be relentlessly subversive.
Mhm.
So Greenblatt contends that Shakespeare's plays confirm that the origin of princely power lies in the Machiavellian usages of force and fraud. And yet, seemingly paradoxically, the plays draw audiences towards the celebration of that power. So, yeah, classic, very interesting essay. John Julius Norwich, Shakespeare's Kings,
Mm.
published by Faber and Faber in 2018. I love that book. I
Oh,
think
that
that's a
sounds awesome.
tremendous. Oh, if you haven't read it, Rachel, you have to get it.
Yeah,
Um,
that sounds
it's,
great.
it's brilliant, it's comprehensive, but it's also incredibly accessible.
Hmm.
It functions very much as a trade book, I think. And then, of course, we have our good friend EMW Tilliard's Shakespeare's history plays. And as we've touched upon, Tilliard examines the history plays and argues that they reveal a providential design. So he essentially sees Shakespeare's dramas as providing a political testament with a grand unifying vision that perpetuates the Tudor myth.
Well, let's
So
see.
there you go.
I can recommend a couple things. Is that all the books? Did you get them all?
That's all of
That's
the
it.
book.
That's a good list. Um,
Yeah, thank you.
um, Holinshed's chronicles are available
Yes.
online. Anybody can read them, and they're very accessible. And that will give you a much better idea of how much Shakespeare was manipulating the narrative for
Yeah.
whatever purpose he had. A lot of the discussions I end up having online is people who think that Shakespeare just made it all up, that, you know, he invented, evil Joan of Arc all on his own. And
Mm,
it's just not true. It's just not true. So
mm,
that's very helpful. And there's a series of videos. It's under the channel Shakespeare and Politics, and it's a series of lectures by the University of Virginia professor Paul Cantor,
yeah.
and they're wonderful. He really goes into depth because he's, both a Shakespeare nerd and a political science professor, and he has a lot of very interesting insights. I don't agree with him all the time, of course, but
Mm,
I think it's a wonderful series.
that's a good recommendation. Yeah, really good.
All
That was
righty.
fun. That was fun. And we've reached the end of this episode.
We
Thanks
have.
and ever thanks to those of you watching and listening to Shakespeare and Friends. And until the next time, it's a warm farewell from Rachel and me.
Bye-bye.